The Calterii Empire had never lost a war. Not once. Not in 11,000 years of recorded conquest. So when the Grand Council voted to erase a single blue planet from existence, nobody expected a problem. They expected a Tuesday. They sent 1 million warships. Every single one of them was destroyed. And the thing that terrified the survivors wasn't how they died. It was that nobody ever found out how. Admiral Vex Threnal had commanded fleets before. He'd burned 3 rebel systems to ash. He'd watched entire civilizations kneel the moment his flagship entered orbit. He was, by every metric the Empire used, a legend. He did not consider Earth a threat. He considered it an inconvenience. The reports from the scout drones were almost insulting in their mundanity. A single yellow star. A rocky third planet. Primitive radio signals leaking out for less than 2 centuries. No fusion drives. No orbital defense grid. No sign of anything resembling a coordinated planetary military. By every metric that mattered, humanity was a rounding error. But here's the thing about rounding errors. Sometimes they add up to something nobody accounted for. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system, past the orbit of what humans called Neptune. 1 million ships. Enough firepower to crack a planet's crust like an egg. Enough soldiers to occupy 1,000 worlds. Vex stood on the observation deck of his flagship, the Ashbringer, and watched the pale blue dot grow larger on the view screen. He felt nothing. Not excitement. Not dread. Just the calm certainty of a predator that had never once been prey. Sensors report no response from the target world, said his tactical officer, a thin, chittering being named Sarthis. No launches. No signal changes. Nothing. They don't know we're here, Vex said. Or they don't care, Sarthis replied. Vex almost laughed. Almost. He didn't know it yet. But that sentence would be the last accurate thing anyone on his bridge ever said. 300,000 kilometers from Earth, the fleet began its final approach. That's when the first ship went dark. Not destroyed, not damaged, just gone from every sensor at once, like someone had reached out and erased it from the universe. Report, Vex snapped. The Devourer's Fong has stopped transmitting, Sarthis said, voice tightening. All channels, all telemetry, it's just silent. Could be a malfunction. Sir, its escort ships aren't responding either. 3 vessels, sir. Simultaneously. Vex felt something he hadn't felt in decades. A small, cold itch at the base of his skull that every predator species evolved to recognize. He was being watched. He just didn't know by what. Within 4 minutes, 12 more ships had gone silent. Within 10 minutes, that number was 70. Vex ordered a full sensor sweep of local space. Nothing. No weapons fire detected. No energy signatures. No debris. The ships weren't being destroyed in any way his instruments could measure. They were simply ceasing to exist. Sir, Sarthis said, and now there was real fear in the chittering voice. I don't think this is coming from the planet. Then where? I don't know. I don't know, sir. There's nothing out there. There's nothing on any spectrum. But we're losing ships. Somewhere in the back half of the formation, a captain screamed something over the open channel before his signal cut out mid-syllable. Nobody on the bridge said anything for a long moment. Then the second wave began. Down on the surface, in a hardened bunker beneath the Colorado mountains, a woman named Dr. Elena Osei watched the same event unfold on a screen built from technology that shouldn't have existed for another 300 years. She wasn't panicked. She'd been waiting for this day for 6 years. They're finding the perimeter, she said quietly. Beside her, General Marcus Cole didn't look up from the display. How many left? 900,000, give or take. It's still calibrating. And the ones we caught? Being studied, piece by piece. Elena allowed herself the smallest smile. They're going to wish they'd stayed home. What none of them knew yet, what the Calterii fleet was only beginning to understand, was that Earth's greatest defense had nothing to do with weapons. It had to do with what happens when you threaten a species that spent its entire history killing far worse things than aliens. Each other. Vex ordered the fleet to converge and form a defensive sphere. 1,000,000 ships collapsing inward into a single fortified formation, weapons hot, shields at maximum. It didn't matter. Ships kept disappearing from the inside of the formation, from the center, from positions that should have been the safest in the entire fleet. "Sir, I have a theory," Sardis said, hands shaking over his console. "I think whatever this is, it's already inside our formation. It's been inside since before we arrived." "That's not possible. Our sensors would have." "Our sensors detected nothing on the way in either, sir. And look at the loss pattern." Sardis pulled up a display. Scattered points across the fleet, no logical center, no directional bias. "This isn't an attack from outside. This is something that's already among us." Vex stared at the pattern for a long time. Then he did something he had never done in 11,000 years of Calterii military doctrine. He gave the order to retreat. It was already too late. The truth, the thing that would haunt every surviving Calterii for the rest of their lives, assuming any of them survived, was simpler and more horrifying than anything they imagined. Humanity hadn't built a superweapon. Humanity had built something worse: patience. 6 years earlier, when the first faint traces of an approaching Calterii scout fleet had been detected by an amateur radio astronomer in rural Australia, the governments of Earth had done something they'd never managed to do for climate change, for pandemics, for anything. They'd actually worked together. Quietly. Completely. Every intelligence agency, every research lab, every defense contractor on the planet had pooled everything they had. Not to build bigger guns. Humanity already knew, deep in its bones, that it couldn't outgun a civilization 11,000 years older than itself. So they didn't try. Instead, they built infiltration technology. Stealth systems that didn't hide from sensors. They fed sensors false information from the inside. Microscopic self-replicating probes, seated across the outer solar system years in advance, that could ride along undetected on the hull of anything that entered the system. By the time the Calterii fleet dropped out of hyperspace, it wasn't approaching an undefended planet. It was flying directly into a trap that had been 6 years in the making. "Sir, I'm reading anomalous power fluctuations across 200 ships," Sardis said, sweat beading on his carapace. "Internal systems. It's like something is rewriting our own hardware from within. Purge all external connections. Isolate every system. I've tried. It's not external anymore. It was never external. Sir, I think they seeded this fleet before we ever left our own territory." Vex's blood ran cold, or would have if Calterii blood ran that way. "That's impossible. This fleet was assembled in our home shipyards, under full security." "I know, sir. Nobody could have gotten past our security." "I know, sir." The lights on the bridge flickered. Somewhere below decks, an engine core screamed and went silent. "Then how?" Vex whispered. Nobody answered him, because nobody knew yet that 6 years earlier, a Calterii long-range scout ship had been quietly and briefly boarded during a routine deep space refueling stop, boarded by something small enough to fit through a maintenance vent, patient enough to wait 6 years without triggering a single alarm, and thorough enough to replicate itself across an entire home fleet before a single shot was ever fired. Humanity hadn't invaded the Calterii Empire. They'd already been living inside it. By the 2-hour mark, the fleet had lost 60% of its ships. Panic, a concept the Calterii military doctrine considered beneath a soldier's dignity, had become impossible to hide. Communication channels dissolved into chaos. Captains broke formation. Some tried to flee back toward hyperspace jump points. Most never made it. Vex watched his once invincible armada collapse in real time, and for the first time in his long career, he understood something that every human child learns before the age of 10. Sometimes the monster isn't the thing you can see coming. "Sir," Sarthis said, voice barely a whisper now. "The planet. Look at the planet." Vex turned to the main view screen. Earth hung there, blue and quiet and utterly unbothered, exactly as it had for the entire engagement. No fleet had launched from its surface. No orbital platforms had opened fire. No signal had been sent. It hadn't needed to do anything at all. "They never intended to fight us in space," Vex said slowly, the realization settling into his chest like a stone. "They intended to fight us before we ever arrived." At the 3-hour mark, something changed. The remaining 40% of the fleet, roughly 400,000 ships, received a single transmission. Not from Earth. Not from any detectable source at all. It simply appeared on every screen simultaneously, in perfect Calterii script, translated with unsettling precision. It read, "You were never going to win this. You were never even going to fight. Go home. Tell them what patience looks like." Sarthis read it 3 times before he could speak. "Sir, should we respond?" Vex didn't answer immediately. He was watching the tactical display, where ships continued to vanish in slow, unhurried succession. Not in a wave, not in a barrage, but in the exact, measured cadence of something that had already won and was simply finishing the paperwork. "There's no one to respond to," he finally said. "There's no fleet out there. There's no fortress. There's nothing to shoot at. This isn't a battle." "Then what is it?" Vex closed his eyes. "It's a demonstration." What almost nobody in the Calterii command structure understood, what Vex was only beginning to grasp in his final hour of command, was that humanity had never planned to win a war of firepower. They'd studied the Calterii for 6 years the way a chess grandmaster studies an opponent's every prior match. They knew the fleet's supply chains. They knew its shipyards. They knew the names of its commanders, the psychological profiles of its admirals, the exact tolerances of its hull plating. They knew all of this not because they'd stolen it in some dramatic heist, but because for 6 quiet years humanity's self-replicating infiltration probes had been sitting inside Calterii infrastructure, patient as sediment, listening. Humanity's advantage was never going to be strength. It was going to be the fact that nobody on the Calterii side had ever considered that a primitive species might simply choose not to fight fair. At the 4-hour mark, the Ashbringer itself began losing power. "Core systems failing," Sarthis reported, and for the first time, there was something almost like acceptance in his voice. "We have maybe 20 minutes before total shutdown." Vex looked around his bridge, at the officers who had followed him through 3 system conquests, at the crew who had trusted him to bring them home, and made a decision that would define the rest of his very short remaining life. "Get an escape pod ready. 1. For the black box and the mission logs." "Sir, what about?" "That's an order, Sarthis. Someone has to tell the council what happened here. Someone has to warn them." Sarthis hesitated, then nodded and moved to comply. He didn't know that the escape pod's guidance systems had been compromised 4 hours earlier, the same moment everything else had. The pod launched at the 4-hour, 12-minute mark. It made it exactly 200 kilometers before its engines cut out in perfect, eerie silence, drifting dead in the void alongside the wreckage of 900,000 other ships. Back on the Ashbringer's bridge, Vex watched the pod's telemetry go flat on his display and understood, with total clarity, that there would be no warning delivered to the council. There would be no survivor's account. There would be no lesson learned by anyone who hadn't lived through it firsthand. "They're not just defeating us," he said quietly. They're erasing the evidence that we ever posed a threat at all. Why would they do that? Sarthis asked. Vex thought of the message still glowing faintly on his auxiliary screen. Go home. Tell them what patience looks like. I think, he said, they wanted at least one of us to understand, just not to report it. At the 5-hour mark, the Ashbringer's main reactor failed. Emergency lighting cast the bridge in dim red. Around Vex, his crew worked in near silence, running through procedures they all privately knew wouldn't matter. Sir, Sarthis said, I want you to know it was an honor. Vex almost smiled. Almost. Save it. We're not dead yet. Sir, respectfully, I think we are. We just haven't stopped moving. Outside the viewport, the wreckage of the Calterii Armada stretched in every direction. A graveyard the size of a solar system, each hull perfectly intact, perfectly silent, perfectly and mysteriously dead. Not a single explosion. Not a single visible wound. 1,000,000 warships, destroyed without a single confirmed shot fired by anything anyone could see. There's something almost respectful about it, Vex murmured. No violence, no suffering, just an ending. Is that supposed to be comforting, sir? No, Vex said. It's supposed to be a warning, and I think we're the last ones who'll ever hear it properly. Down on Earth, 6 hours after the fleet's arrival, Dr. Elena Osei stood in the command bunker and watched the last major cluster of Calterii signals fade from her monitors. Status, General Cole said. Fleet is at 8% operational capacity and dropping. No coordinated resistance detected in the last 90 minutes. I'd call this concluded. Casualties on our side? Elena allowed herself a small, tired breath. 0. Same as projected. Cole finally looked up. 6 years of planning, and not one American, not one human being anywhere on this planet, so much as broke a sweat. That was the point, Elena said. We didn't build this to fight a war. We built it so we'd never have to. Outside the bunker, above the clouds, in the cold silence of near-Earth space, the last handful of Calterii ships drifted powerless, among the wreckage of everything they'd once believed made them unstoppable. Vex Threnal's flagship lost all power at the 6-hour, 4-minute mark. In the final moments before the life support failed completely, Sarthis turned to his admiral with a question that had clearly been building in him for hours. Sir, if they could do all of this without ever showing themselves, without ever risking a single soldier, why did they even bother waiting for us to arrive? Why not simply stop us before we ever left home? Vex considered the question in the dark, in the cold, in the last few minutes of a career and a life that had begun with the absolute certainty of victory and was ending in absolute, humbling defeat. Because, he finally said, I think they wanted us to see it happen. I think they wanted at least one witness who understood exactly what they were capable of. Not to gloat, to warn. Warn who, sir? We're not going to be reporting back to anyone. Vex managed something close to a bitter, exhausted laugh. No, but somewhere out there, they're already watching for the next fleet. And the one after that. And they'll be ready for every single one, the exact same way they were ready for us. Long before anyone ever left port. The lights went out. The Calterii Grand Council waited 7 months for any word from the invasion fleet. None ever came. No black box. No survivor's account. No wreckage recovered. No distress signal. 1,000,000 warships, an entire generation of Calterii military might, had traveled to the edge of known space and simply vanished, as completely and silently as if they had never existed at all. 3 separate reconnaissance missions were quietly authorized to investigate. All 3 returned with nothing but confirmation of debris fields, sensor logs full of static, and a growing, unspoken dread among the officers who reviewed the data. Whatever had happened at that pale blue world, humanity had made absolutely certain that no one would ever fully understand it. Not the tactics, not the technology, not the timeline, just the outcome. 1,000,000 ships sent. 0 ships returned. Somewhere in a quiet, unassuming research facility outside of a small town nobody outside the program had ever heard of, Dr. Elena Ose filed the final report on Operation Quiet Room, 6 years and one very short, very one-sided war in the making. The report was 11 pages long. Most of it was redacted before it ever left the building. The last line, however, remained untouched, and years later would become something of an unofficial motto passed quietly between the handful of people on Earth who knew the full truth of what had happened that day. They came expecting a battle. We gave them a lesson. Most species send their strongest. We simply outlasted them. Every single one. Somewhere far beyond the edges of the solar system, in the cold dark between stars, more scout ships from more distant empires were already beginning to notice the strange, quiet, terrifyingly patient blue planet that had erased an entire invasion fleet without ever firing a single visible shot. They would come anyway. Empires always do. And Earth, quiet and patient as it had always been, would be waiting. Interlude. The soldier who never fired a shot. Not every hero of this story wore a lab coat or held a general's rank. Some of them never even knew the full picture of what they were part of. Corporal James Whitfield had spent 11 years in the Army before he was quietly reassigned to a facility that didn't officially exist, doing work he wasn't allowed to describe to his own wife. His job, for 6 years, had nothing to do with combat. His job was babysitting a server room. "I used to joke that I had the most boring top-secret job on the planet," he said, in a rare, heavily redacted interview years later. "I watched status lights. That was it. Green means good. Red means somebody wakes me up at 3 in the morning. For 6 years, the lights stayed green. Then, on the day the fleet arrived, every single light in that server room turned red at once, and James understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, that the quiet, boring job he'd been doing for 6 years had just become the single most important 8 hours of his entire career. "I didn't do anything heroic," he insisted. "I hit the switch we'd rehearsed 100 times. That's it. That's the whole story. But I remember thinking, in that moment, that somewhere out there, people who had no idea I existed were alive because of a button I'd practiced pressing in a windowless room for 6 years. That, in the end, was the quiet, unglamorous truth behind humanity's victory. It wasn't won by a single genius or a single weapon. It was won by thousands of people like James, doing small, patient, unglamorous jobs, for years, without ever knowing if any of it would matter." Interlude. The voice on the comm. Not every human involved in Operation Quiet Room worked in a bunker. Some worked in plain sight and never knew it. Dr. Naomi Reyes was a linguist, recruited 18 months into the program for a task that seemed, at the time, almost absurdly narrow. Translate a limited set of intercepted Calterii communications well enough to craft a single message, to be delivered only once, only if the operation succeeded exactly as planned. She spent 4 years on that one message, rewriting it, testing it against every fragment of Calterii linguistic and cultural data the team could gather, making sure that whatever was finally transmitted would land not as a threat, not as gloating, but as something colder and more effective, a simple statement of fact. "We debated for months whether to send anything at all," she said. "Some people on the team wanted total silence. No message, no explanation, just an empty system and a mystery they'd never solve. I understood the argument. Silence is its own kind of terror. But in the end, I argued for the message, because I didn't want them to spend the next 100 years wondering if it had been an accident, or a fluke, or bad luck. I wanted them to know with absolute certainty that it had been a choice, that we'd seen them coming, we'd prepared, and we'd won. Not because we were stronger, because we were smarter and more patient and willing to wait longer than they ever imagined we could. The message went out at the 3-hour mark of the engagement, exactly as planned, to every remaining Calterii vessel simultaneously. You were never going to win this. You were never even going to fight. Go home. Tell them what patience looks like. 11 words in the original English draft. 43 in the final translated Calterii version, adjusted carefully for tone, formality, and the specific cultural weight the Calterii placed on concepts like patience and inevitability. I rewrote that message probably 400 times over 4 years, Naomi said. In the end, the version that went out was maybe the 40th attempt. Everything else we scrapped. Too aggressive, too desperate, too human in the wrong way. What's the wrong way to be human? The interviewer asked. She considered the question for a long moment. Loud, she finally said. We didn't want them to remember us as loud. Interlude, the one that got away. Not every part of Operation Quiet Room went according to plan. History, even quiet, hidden history, rarely does. Of the 1,000,000 ships in the Calterii fleet, exactly one, a lightly armed reconnaissance vessel operating well outside the main formation, escaped the initial shutdown sequence entirely. A hardware fault, ironically unrelated to anything Earth had done, had left its systems running on an isolated backup network that the probes had never fully mapped. For 11 minutes, that single ship represented the single greatest threat to 6 years of careful, patient planning. We knew about it almost immediately, Cole admitted. And for about 90 seconds, I genuinely believed the entire operation was about to fail because of one ship nobody had accounted for. The ship's captain, a young, relatively low-ranking officer named Threl Yassa, spent those 11 minutes desperately trying to raise anyone else in the fleet on comms, receiving nothing but silence in return. Confused, isolated, and increasingly alarmed, she made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She ran, not toward Earth, away from it, back toward the system's hyperspace boundary, convinced that whatever was happening to the rest of the fleet, her best chance of survival, and of warning the Empire, was distance. She very nearly made it. A secondary contingency, built into the operation specifically for a scenario exactly like this one, activated with less than 4 minutes to spare. A dormant Earth-built interceptor drone, stationed at the system's edge for exactly this possibility, disabled Yassa's ship's hyperdrive before it could complete the jump calculation. Her ship drifted, powerless but intact, alongside the wreckage of the rest of the fleet. She was, as far as anyone on Earth was ever able to determine, the only Calterii survivor of the entire engagement. What happened to her afterward remains one of the most tightly classified details of the entire operation, sealed under restrictions that won't lift for another 80 years. But those who worked closest to the program have occasionally hinted, carefully and off the record, that Threl Yassa is very much still alive, and that she has spent every year since that day helping humanity understand, in patient, painstaking detail, exactly what kind of empire it now knows is out there. Whether that makes her a prisoner, a defector, or something else entirely depends entirely on who you ask. Interlude. What the world never knew. Perhaps the strangest detail of the entire operation is how little the general public ever learned about it. Even years later. There was no victory parade, no press conference, no dramatic reveal of a hidden alien war fought and won in total secrecy. To the vast majority of Earth's 8 billion people, that 6-hour period passed like any other Tuesday. Traffic moved. Markets opened and closed. Children went to school. That was deliberate too, Elena explained. We debated it endlessly. Do you tell people? Do you let the world know how close it came? In the end, we decided against it. Not because we didn't trust people to handle the truth. Because we didn't know what a species that just found out aliens are real, and had already tried to kill us once, would do with that knowledge. Panic isn't a strategy. Secrecy, as uncomfortable as it is, at least bought us time to prepare properly for whatever comes next. Only a small handful of people across the entire planet ever knew the full scope of what had happened above their heads that day. A few dozen scientists, a few hundred military personnel, a handful of world leaders, briefed only on a need-to-know basis, sworn to a silence most of them would carry to their graves. Everyone else simply lived their lives, never knowing how close, or how quietly, the world had come to ending, and how quietly it had been saved instead. Epilogue 6 years earlier. To understand how a single unremarkable planet erased 1 million warships without firing a shot anyone could see, you have to go back. Not to the day the fleet arrived. Not even to the day the first warning signal was detected. You have to go back to a basement office in Geneva, where a tired Australian radio astronomer named Priya Anand sat staring at a signal spike that shouldn't have existed. It was 3:47 in the morning. She'd been awake for 19 hours, and she was about to become the single most important person on the planet, and almost nobody would ever know her name. "That's not a pulsar," she muttered to herself. "Pulsars don't accelerate." She ran the data again. Same result. Something was moving through the outer solar system, decelerating in a pattern no natural object could produce. She picked up the phone. 6 hours later, that phone call had reached the desks of 11 different national security agencies. By the end of the week, it had reached 14 more. And by the end of the month, for the first time in recorded human history, every major intelligence apparatus on Earth was sharing raw data with its supposed rivals in real time without hesitation. Not because anyone suddenly trusted each other, because everyone understood, almost instantly, that there wasn't going to be a version of this where humanity survived divided. The first 18 months were the hardest. Nobody knew what the ships were. Nobody knew if they were scouts, traders, or the vanguard of an invasion. The Calterii, as they would come to be called once linguists managed to crack fragments of decrypted communication chatter, hadn't announced themselves. They'd simply been detected, quietly cataloging the solar system's resources from a discreet distance, the way a burglar cases a house before deciding whether it's worth the risk. General Marcus Cole, then a colonel, remembered the exact moment the mood in the room shifted from fear to something colder and more useful. "We kept asking the wrong question," he said later, in a debrief that would remain classified for decades. "We kept asking, how do we beat them? That's the wrong question when the thing you're up against is 11,000 years further along than you. The right question is, how do we make sure we're the last thing they ever expect?" It was Dr. Elena Osei, then a mid-level researcher in a nanotechnology lab that officially didn't exist, who reframed the entire strategy in a single sentence during a briefing that ran 14 hours past its scheduled end. "We can't outgun something that's been building warships since before we had written language," she said. "But nobody builds a defense against an enemy they've never had to consider. And nobody in 11,000 years of conquest has ever had to consider an enemy that doesn't fight back the way they expect." The room went quiet. "What are you proposing?" someone finally asked. "I'm proposing we don't fight a war," Elena said. "I'm proposing we become part of their supply chain before they ever know we exist." It sounded insane. It was insane by any conventional definition of military strategy. The plan, once it took shape over the following year, hinged on a single piece of intelligence nobody had expected to matter. The Calterii scout ships, confident in a security record spanning 11 millennia, occasionally made refueling and resupply stops at the edges of surveyed systems, using automated way stations that hadn't been meaningfully upgraded in centuries. Old systems. Predictable systems. Systems built by a species that had simply never needed to worry about being infiltrated, because nobody they'd ever encountered had the patience or the subtlety to try. Humanity had both. What Earth's combined research effort built over the next 4 years wasn't a weapon in any traditional sense. It was closer to a virus if a virus could think, adapt, and wait. Self-replicating microprobes, smaller than a grain of rice, capable of dormancy for years at a stretch, designed not to attack but to listen, to map, to embed themselves in the deepest architecture of any system they touched and simply stay there, multiplying slowly, quietly, patiently. The first successful contact came during a routine Calterii deep space refueling stop at a waystation 11 light-years from Earth, a location humanity had no business knowing about, let alone reaching. They reached it anyway, quietly, without a single Calterii sensor ever registering the intrusion. "You have to understand what we were actually building," Elena said years later, in the only interview she ever gave about Operation Quiet Room, conducted under conditions of total anonymity for a historical archive that wouldn't be unsealed for another 50 years. "We weren't building something to blow up their ships. Explosions get noticed. Explosions get investigated. What we built was something that could sit inside a system for 6 years, invisible, patient, mapping every vulnerability, every command structure, every hardware dependency, and then, on a single signal, simply turn everything off. Not destroy," she clarified. "Turn off. There's a difference. Destruction leaves evidence. Evidence gets studied. Studied things get countered next time. We didn't want there to be a next time worth preparing for." By the time the probes had fully embedded themselves across Calterii shipping lanes, refueling stations, and eventually, through years of patient replication, actual shipyard infrastructure, humanity had achieved something no civilization the Calterii had ever encountered had managed. They had become invisible not by hiding, but by becoming part of the furniture. There were setbacks. Of course there were setbacks. In year 3, a probe cluster was nearly discovered during a routine Calterii maintenance sweep, when an engineer noticed anomalous power draw in a secondary conduit. For 6 agonizing days, the team monitoring the feedback on Earth watched in real time as the engineer ran diagnostics, each one bringing him closer to a discovery that would have unraveled 6 years of work in an instant. "We almost called it," Cole admitted later. "We almost pulled everything back and started over from scratch." They didn't, because Elena's team had built one more feature into the probes that nobody outside the innermost circle knew about. A decoy protocol, designed to mimic a known, benign hardware fault common to that exact model of Calterii maintenance conduit. The engineer filed a routine repair ticket, replaced a component that didn't need replacing, and moved on with his day. He never knew he'd just saved and doomed an entire empire in the same afternoon. By year 5, the probes had achieved something the team back on Earth had almost stopped believing was possible. Full, silent integration into the command and control architecture of an actual Calterii war fleet, assembled at one of the Empire's primary shipyards for a purpose nobody on Earth yet understood. That purpose became horrifyingly clear 3 months later, when decrypted Calterii communications confirmed what everyone had feared since the beginning. Earth had been designated a target, not for negotiation, not for study, for elimination. There was no debate about what to do next, Cole said. There wasn't a moment where anyone in that room asked whether we should proceed. There was only the question of when. The answer came sooner than anyone expected. Calterii deployment orders moved faster than Earth's intelligence had projected, giving the defense team barely 6 months of final preparation before the fleet departed for Sol. 6 months to finish mapping every ship's internal architecture through the probes already embedded inside them. 6 months to write, test, and quietly upload a dormant shutdown protocol into systems the ship's own engineers didn't know existed. 6 months to make absolutely certain that when the moment came, there would be no warning, no error message, no diagnostic flag that could be traced back to its source. "We had one shot," Elena said. "One. If even a fraction of that fleet made it through with a working communication array, If even one ship managed to transmit a coherent warning back to the Calterii homeworld before going dark, everything we'd built for 6 years would become useless. They'd know. And the next fleet would come prepared. That was the real engineering challenge in the end. Not building something that could disable 1,000,000 warships. Building something that could disable 1,000,000 warships in absolute, total silence, so completely that not even the people being disabled would understand what had killed them until it was already far too late to matter. Back aboard the Ashbringer, Hour 1. None of this, of course, was known to Admiral Vex Threnal as his fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system that morning, 6 years after a tired astronomer in Geneva first noticed a signal that shouldn't exist. All Vex knew was that his sensors reported an undefended, primitive world, and that victory, as it always had been throughout his career, seemed like a formality. He didn't know that half his fleet's internal diagnostic systems had already been quietly rewritten years earlier, waiting for a single trigger signal to activate. He didn't know that the trigger had been sent the moment his fleet crossed the outer edge of the system, encoded in a burst of background radiation so faint that no Calterii sensor had ever been designed to notice it. He didn't know that every single one of the malfunctions his crew would spend the next 6 hours desperately trying to diagnose wasn't a malfunction at all. It was a countdown, and it had started the moment he'd arrived. Hour 2. What the Council would never learn. There's a detail that never made it into any official Calterii record, mostly because nobody who witnessed it survived to report it, but which was captured, ironically, by the very probes that caused it. In the final moments before each ship's systems failed, a strange calm would sometimes settle over the crew. Not because they'd accepted their fate, because the probes, in their final act before triggering full shutdown, gently powered down life support in a sequence designed to minimize suffering. No decompression, no fire, no violent hull breach, just a slow, deliberate fade, ship by ship, into silence. It was, in its own strange way, the most human thing about the entire operation. A species capable of eliminating an invading force chose, when given the option, not to make them suffer for the crime of nearly destroying an entire world. People assume revenge was part of the motivation, Elena said, in that same unsealed interview. It wasn't. We didn't build this because we hated them. We built it because we didn't want to die. There's a difference, and I think it mattered, in the end, that we never lost sight of that difference. Hour 3. The question Vex never got to ask. If Admiral Vex Threnal had survived long enough to ask one final question of his enemy, it might have been the same question every Calterii officer who studied the wreckage in the years that followed would eventually ask. Why didn't Earth ever launch a single ship of its own? The answer, had anyone been alive to give it, was almost embarrassingly simple. Humanity had never intended to fight a war in space. They understood, from the very first briefing 6 years earlier, that any conflict fought on Calterii terms, ship against ship, weapon against weapon, force against force, was a conflict Earth would lose, decisively and immediately, regardless of how clever its engineers were. So they simply refused to fight that war. They fought a different one instead. A quiet one. Patient one. A war fought not with weapons but with time and trust, and the simple, overlooked fact that a species with 11,000 years of unbroken victory had never once had to consider what an enemy who refused to lose might actually be capable of. Aftermath. What was left behind? In the months following the destruction of the fleet, small fragments of wreckage occasionally drifted close enough to Earth's monitoring network to be studied in careful, controlled conditions. What researchers found, again and again, was the same unsettling pattern. No battle damage. No weapons discharge residue. No structural failure consistent with combat. Just ships that had, for all practical purposes, simply stopped. It's going to take them years to even understand what happened here, Cole said, reviewing the final consolidated report 6 months after the engagement. And by the time they do, if they ever do, we'll already be 3 steps further along than we are today. Elena nodded, though her expression carried less triumph than exhaustion. That was always the point, not to win one battle, to make sure nobody would ever consider us worth the risk of a second one. And if they do anyway? She looked out at the quiet night sky, at stars that no longer felt quite as distant or as safe as they once had. Then we'll be ready, the way we were ready this time, the way we'll always be ready, for as long as it takes. Final transmission. 7 months after the fleet's disappearance, a single automated Calterii probe, dispatched quietly and without official sanction by a low-ranking analyst who couldn't stop thinking about the silence, arrived at the edge of the Sol system. It drifted for 11 days, cataloging the debris field in careful, methodical detail, before a final, brief transmission was sent back toward Calterii space. Most of the data would take years to fully decrypt and analyze, but the last line of the probe's automated summary report, when it was finally translated in full, required no further analysis at all. Debris field consistent with total fleet loss. No survivors detected. No hostile signatures detected. No explanation available. Recommend extreme caution regarding any future contact with this system. The analyst who received that report never filed it through official channels. He simply saved a copy, quietly, in a private archive, and told no one what he suspected. That the quietest planet in the galaxy might also be the most dangerous one. And that whatever Earth had done to 1,000,000 warships, it had done without ever once needing to raise its voice. Coda. What the stars didn't see. Years later, long after Operation Quiet Room had faded from active discussion even among the few who'd lived it, General Marcus Cole, now retired, gave a single, unofficial talk to a small closed-door gathering of incoming defense personnel who had just been read into the program for the first time. He didn't talk about tactics. He didn't talk about the technology, most of which had evolved so far beyond its original form that the early probes seemed almost quaint by comparison. He talked about the 6 years before the fleet ever arrived. The years nobody remembers because nothing dramatic happened in them. No battles. No speeches. Just thousands of people all over the planet doing small, careful, patient work, day after day, for a threat most of them weren't even certain was real. People think victory looks like the moment the fighting stops, he told the room. It doesn't. Victory looks like every boring, unglamorous day before that, when nobody's watching and you do the work anyway, because you understand that the fight you're preparing for might be the only one you ever get to fight, and you don't get a second chance to get it right. He paused, looking around the room at faces that hadn't yet fully absorbed the weight of what they'd just been trusted with. They sent 1,000,000 ships, he said. Not one went home. And the only reason that's true is that 6 years earlier, a tired woman in Geneva looked at a screen at 4 in the morning and decided not to ignore what she saw. He let that sit for a moment. So when you're sitting in a windowless room at 3 in the morning, doing work that feels like it doesn't matter, remember her. Remember that the whole thing, every ship, every life, every quiet, invisible victory this planet has ever won, started with someone who refused to look away. The room was silent for a long time after that. Somewhere far above them, past the edge of the atmosphere, past the moon, past the wrecked and drifting debris field that still, even now, occasionally caught sunlight at just the right angle to be visible from certain telescopes, Earth continued to turn. Quiet, patient, waiting, exactly as it always had been. The end.